morning and good afternoon to all of you that have tuned in. My name is Sudha David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to our Transatlantic Tuesday series. Transatlantic Tuesdays is a series that brings together decision makers from across the Atlantic to discuss pertinent issues that are important to both the US and the United States. And before we get started with today's discussion, I'd like to thank our Business Alliance partners for supporting this series and making it possible. Today, we're going to discuss the so-called Citrus Coalition and how the Greens and the Liberals captured the German youth vote during the German federal election at the end of September. Well, as always, we're going to start with a brief moderated conversation for about 15 to 20 minutes. I encourage all of you to pose your questions through the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen throughout the discussion, and my colleague Peter will get to them very quickly. If you have the question directed at a certain person, you can note that in the Q&A box. We have a great panel today. First, we have Sara Maria Behbehani. She's an editor at the Süddeutsche Zeitung, a major regional paper in Germany. Then we have Charlotte Unnerstall, who is political director of the Green Youth in Brandenburg. And then Nemir Ali, who is vice chair of the Young Liberals. Thank you all for being with us today. And I'm very happy to be able to hand over the floor now to my wonderful colleague, Peter Sparding, who is a transatlantic fellow at GMF's Washington, D.C. office. Peter, floor is yours. Have a great discussion.
Great. Thank you, Sudha, and thank you for inviting me. It's exciting to be able to speak about the youth vote for me, since this makes me feel younger than I am. I am not part of the youth vote, so I'm going to be asking the questions and then have the wonderful speakers we have lined up give us some insights in what they think happened and why it happened and what it all means. One thing I do share with the panelists, I thought about this in preparation. You are all from a generation that basically grew up with one chancellor in the last 16 years, and I'm basically one generation older and had a similar experience, just with the chancellor's name was Kohl, and you have the Merkel experience. Now, the difference, and I think we should get into this maybe in the discussion, is that after Kohl, there was basically the other side took over, but it was still the other big party was in the lead. This time we have obviously a very different setup, and this is shown here in who we have invited to come and speak with us. We're now in the phase of forming a government in Germany with three parties, including the FDP and the Greens, from whom we have representatives here today. So that's a whole different experience all around. But I thought I would start by asking Sara to kind of help us understand what she thought or things happened in the elections. What we saw clearly that the youth vote, and that's why we have this setup, was there was a large show of support for both the Greens and the FDP in the youth vote that surprised many. Maybe it shouldn't have. Maybe they were all older like me and didn't see it coming. We'll hear about this. But Sara, first of all, could you tell us what exactly was the outcome in the youth vote, and what do you make of it? How did this come about? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, the youth vote surprised probably many people because, the FDP was, with the Greens, the most popular party for first-time voters. In this group, 23% voted for the Greens and also 23% voted for the Free Democrats. And in the group of people between 18 and 24, again, 23% voted for the Green Party and 21% for the Liberals. And for young people, in my experience, it's actually funny when also we as journalists are asking them all these questions now. Some of them called it their own special boomer moment now. And well, really, if you take a look at the elections from a young perspective, it's not that surprising, because after years of a coalition of the two formerly big people's parties, I think it's safe to say that it was a vote for change, a vote against the status quo, against standing still, because right now for young people in Germany, this standing still is not really an option anymore. And you have to look back a few years. The government of the last few years failed to address the topics that will play a big role in the future. For instance, of course, there's climate change. They didn't tackle the climate crisis as they should have. And this is the one big topic of the Greens. But then there's also digitalization. I mean, in the Corona crisis, our health services were still communicating via faxes. And also the big coalition presented no plan on how they wanted to secure our pensions in an aging society. And those are the topics of the Free Democrats. And both of them, Free Democrats and Greens, were campaigning for a modern immigration law because we still don't have that. While everybody knows that the lack of qualified personnel will become a problem in the future. For example, in the healthcare sector, we'll see a huge lack of personnel. And also the Greens and the Free Democrats had ideas that touched young people. They wanted to implement the right to vote at the age of 16 instead of 18. They wanted to legalize cannabis. And the FDP also stands for freedom. And I think freedom, especially for young people, was a huge issue during the Corona crisis. So voting for these two smaller parties this time was voting for change, was voting for parties that address the problems that will occur in the future, instead of remaining stuck in the present. It was in general voting for a modern country that will change with the changing times we're living in. They kind of created a vision of the future, a new narrative, if you want. And well, when you look at it like this, it's not that surprising anymore.
Yeah, thanks. That was very good, and I think actually, yeah, that does make a lot of sense if you have this, group that is seeking change. I'm going to ask, I guess, Charlotte, not Charlotte, as I might otherwise say. Maybe start with you, because the one thing, Sara laid out quite nicely the topics that young voters were probably focusing on, from climate change, obviously, digitalization, immigration, you mentioned pensions, and then freedom. Interestingly, I think for many observers, the Greens and the FDP are often viewed as as the two parties within this, within the main group of parties that are more opposite each other on many issues. So Sara mentioned the issues, but what does it tell us from your point of view? What motivated? I mean, you can speak to the Green side more if you would like. What exactly are the voters who voted for the Greens, the younger voters? I mean, were they then focused on climate change, and maybe the younger voters who voted on for the FDP on something else, or is it a shared concern for things? So.
I definitely agree with Sara on her analysis about how young people voted on issues that were important to them. But I think there's two levels in this discussion. I think voters were motivated first, of course, by issues that affected them personally, like digitalization, like education, the lack of digitalization in schools, the cliche argument of the legalization of marijuana, for example, like issues that affect them personally in their lives, or also things that seem close, like for example, cars and the speed limits and this kind of stuff. For example, for people I talked to who were like 16, 17 years old, so who were able to drive or would soon be able to drive, the issue of cars and speed limits and all these kind of things sometimes seemed very important because they were close but still unreachable to them. And so this was sometimes an argument that stopped people from voting for the Greens, for example, because they thought that the Greens would set very definite limits and things in their actual day-to-day lives. But I also think at another level, at a much more abstract level, people that voted, like young voters that were motivated enough to vote for any party, were driven by a much more abstract and high-level issues like climate change, for example, or like the kind of more abstract issue of social justice. And if you combine both of these things, climate justice, because I think in the difference with some older cohorts, people were both impacted with their day-to-day lives, but also because, as Sara has mentioned, the parties in their election campaigns, the more progressive parties, if you count the FDP and this, even though they're not left-wing, but they're still progressive in that they want change, they were able to paint a picture of what a country could look like. This was a bit represented in the Greens election spot, which was a take on a German song which was called No More Beautiful Country, or More Beautiful Country, depending on which definition you went with. And they tried, together with also the FDP, tried to paint a picture of what a different Germany could look like. But I think that the difference between voters who voted for the FDP and for the Greens wasn't always or necessarily about issues, but also about like much more basic assumptions about how people interact with each other in a society, and also about, if you like, not to quote Marx in a discussion about German politics, but like in their like, do you want revolution or reform, basically. I mean, if you look at voting numbers, if people think Germany is like generally on a good path, or if it's generally everything is going downhill, you see very clear differences generally in young voters. Because of course, all of us, the three of us here in the discussion, grew up knowing mostly only Merkel as chancellor, but I think people still have very different analyses based on their living circumstances and how they grew up. If Germany is generally like moving in a good direction and things should generally continue the way they are, or if we're steadily moving downhill, and if we don't have drastic change, the world will be unlivable or in an unacceptable state for future generations. And I think it was not only the actual topics that influenced voting behavior, but also kind of these general assumptions. And also, you know, the most quoted one is the most quoted difference between, I think, liberals and Greens is, if people think the state should do more and should take on more tasks, or if like the solution lies in independent entrepreneurship and independent and companies, for example, and in, you know, creative solutions, these kind of things. But I think that's only like the most superficial level of analysis, because in general, it really depends on if you like your opinion of if you think that the state should take on more action or not, really also depends on how you feel that you have been held and protected by the state, or that you have been kind of left behind by the state. And so I think all these issues really impacted young people's voting behavior. But also, of course, we definitely saw people influenced by their day-to-day lives, day-to-day issues, which I think are also the people who were more likely to be like switching voters between different parties, because if you see that the most current pressing issue is, for example, cannabis legalization, then you're more likely to just make your decision dependent on that one decision. Whereas if you're really fundamentally thinking that the system has to be different, that would be your like ticket to vote for the Greens, for example, more likely, or the Left Party, and not the FDP or the SPD.
Thank you. And Nemir, let me ask you a similar question, or basically the same, but with a slight, you know, I think from outside observers from the US or elsewhere, or older observers, they weren't maybe as surprised by the Green support among young people, because we have seen for years now, you know, strong climate movement outside of party politics even, you know, and it's often led by younger people. So that was kind of clearly understood why younger people would support the Green Party. And, you know, but the FDP, I think, surprised some people in this regard. So could you lay out what you think was the driver there? Why, you know, it was mentioned, of course, the Corona pandemic and some of those, digitalization, but maybe you have a specific views on this, or I'm sure you do actually.
Yeah, I do. First of all, I do agree with Sarah. I think her analysis was quite good regarding the topics that were important to young people, and especially also to young people who did vote for the Free Democrats. But when you kind of want to break it down to a theme, why did people who care about similar issues like financial sustainability regarding the pensions, ecological sustainability, climate change, who want a free and open society, which are all points where Greens and liberals are quite close to each other regarding the goal. But the fundamental difference lies in how we want to reach these goals. So when we, for example, look at climate change, we see quite strict quotas, taxes that are, or speed limits suggested by the Green Party, while there's a more open approach of the Free Democrats setting one goal and then having kind of entrepreneurship, innovation of technologies making the job. And when you try to find out what the real difference there is, I think it's kind of the world view. If you think that the state should take over more responsibility, then obviously the Green Party is probably the way to go. But many young people have first experienced during the Corona crisis that the government will not be able to help them. In fact, the government may infringe on their personal rights, may even do it to an extent where it is constitutionally not legal anymore. So, for example, some of the measures imposed by the German governments or by the regional governments were then later declared unconstitutional by the courts. And we have had, for young people, quite a harsh experience during the Corona crisis. And many, I think, in that phase experienced what freedom means, or rather the lack of freedom, and have learned to value freedom more. And then the second point, I think that is for young people quite important. When you're young, when you're like 16, 17, 18, you want to do more on your own. You're already had it for like 18 years. Your parents, your teachers told you what to do. Now you're finally 18, you're able to vote. Why won't you then another one who says what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed, what you should do, what you shouldn't do? I think that there's a drive for self-determination, for personal responsibility also among young people, and the optimism and the courage that they can and want to take care of themselves. And that is something that I think is, especially for voters of the Free Democratic Party, quite important.
Great, yeah, thanks. Sarah, maybe I'll turn back to you just with a more general question. You know, obviously the share of the Greens and the FDP among the young was quite high, but in absolute numbers, given the demographic situation in the country, young people do not make up a huge voting bloc because Germany is aging, as was mentioned earlier. And obviously the biggest party in the proposed coalition now will still be the Social Democratic Party. I'm just wondering if you could kind of embed this, or if you could tell us what you feel, you know, these were first-time voters in a lot of cases that now voted for Greens and FDP. Are they set up for disappointment in the system? Basically, I'm, you know, provocatively here, given that a large segment of the German population is not maybe as keen to see dramatic change as some of the younger voters. What is your take?
This is true, of course, what you're saying. But I still think that the next government with Olaf Scholz as chancellor will have the chance to form a modern Germany and really address the big topics of the future. Because I think Olaf Scholz had really more than 1 year to prepare for that now. When he started his election campaign and said he wanted to become the next chancellor, no one believed this was possible. So he knew that probably his only shot at becoming chancellor would be in the traffic light coalition we're about to see now. And he said on election night that his idea was that they will be very fast and form a coalition before Christmas. So he probably had a plan ready. That's what I think. And I think that we will see a coalition where every party will shine in their own field and make a difference in their own field of expertise. The huge challenge, though, will be to find a solution for the different approaches and how all this should be financed. Because right now it's not clear where all the money will come from. So I think the big question will be if they will paralyze each other with their different financial approaches, or if they will be able to bring this novelty, this vision, these new ideas into the next government.
Yeah, okay, let me ask, maybe this is my final round of questions, so then afterwards, please, I'm gonna let the participants know that they should ask some questions. We have a couple already here in the chat function. Charlotte, so I think what people outside of Germany are obviously interested in is, so what does all of this mean now for the coming government? So of course, from the angle of the young voter, what do you think is the outlook? And if I could ask, since we're at the German Marshall Fund and looking at this from a transatlantic perspective, if you could include maybe your view also what it means for outside of Germany, for Europe, for the relationship with the US. I know, younger people in Germany have a very different view or relationship to the US than many of the older ones. This is the first generation that's fully grown up in unified Germany post-Cold War. So there's a very different sentiment maybe. So if you can tie all of that in nicely in a quick answer, or pick what you want is my offer to you. And then I'll ask a similar question of Nemir before we go to the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the offer. I'll take you up on it. I think one of the most basic assumptions some people have in Germany is that the political landscape in the US is more or less the same than it is in Germany, which it really isn't. Neither in like the actual party landscape, nor in like kind of the very fractured voting behavior, regardless of a two-party system, etc. And I think people are thinking, okay, now Biden has been in office for around like a few months, a year nearly, and Biden is kind of, he's more to the left than Trump is. So Biden is a leftist and Trump was like an extreme right-wing politician. But it's actually not that way. I think many of us have seen these kind of diagrams where you see like on a classic left-right spectrum, the Democrats in the US are kind of comparable to the Christian Democratic Union in some aspects in Germany. And then the SPD, so the Social Democrats, the like the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are all quite like a bit to the left to quite far to the left of the Democratic Party. And of course, I mean, Biden has to implement politics that like are not only like 100% Democratic Party line, same as will like Olaf Scholz and the SPD and the FDP and the Greens will have to do. But I think they're like Olaf Scholz very much kind of likes to present himself as a modern worldly politician who builds bridges. And so I think like he will very much like as chancellor to like to put himself on that level of other world politicians. And I mean, he has quite a bit of international experience also as vice chancellor. So but I think also if you look in the rows of the Greens and the FDP, all of the parties are Europe friendly, so to say. I mean, there's like if there had been a coalition with the left party instead of the FDP, for example, of course there would have there was one of the big questions in the election campaign: how would a red green or red green red coalition look like on foreign policy questions and on international cooperation questions? I think now that we have a Ampelkoalition or a traffic light coalition probably upcoming, in some foreign policy questions, the partners are actually closer together. There's no like, there's only very niche to no movements inside of the parties to, like, for example, leave the European Union or like funnily opposing NATO or all these kind of things. So I think there some progress is actually possible. I think within the coalition or the possible coalition, you see a spectrum of opinions, for example, regarding Russia, which of course will be like one of the most defining foreign policy question within the next 4 years. We have a spectrum from ranging from while we have to work together with Putin and work together with Russia because they're a very important economic partner, to no, we have to have a hard stance against human rights violations and blackmailing of Ukraine and Russia. And so I think it will be difficult and very much depend on who gets access to the State Department or to the Foreign Ministry in Germany, how the coalition will answer these questions. And also another key ministry, of course, will be the development ministry. I think a bit less because I think the development ministry, in the way it has been implemented in the German way and in the German kind of mixture of ministries you have, it's not the most powerful one. It's usually been like kind of a second or third row ministry, if you will. But I think the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the State Department, will be the key players. And so you have seen in the election campaign like names being thrown around. If the Greens could access, for example, the foreign ministry, which would probably result also in a quite a hard stance regarding Russia and China, especially with regard to human rights violations, and less on a focus on like being forced to cooperate economically just because, whereas if, for example, the FDP would get the finance ministry, they would use the levers they have there to implement to influence international cooperation and also cooperation with within the European Union, for example, because with the Greens and the FDP, you see that they have very different approaches to, for example, if the EU should engage in collective European debt and these kind of questions. So I think in these like key ministries, there will be some very important questions regarding international cooperation, both on a EU level and also on an international and transatlantic level, that will probably that have not been decided in the first Sondierungspapier, in the first paper that was written by the partners, and that will probably not be fully addressed in the coalition paper, but that will, like in the coalition, in the paper that forms the basis of the coalition, but will only be decided like within the 4 years of the coalition. So I think we can, like from the election programs, we can see what the parties want, but how in the coalition they will actually be implemented, I think that's a very different question.
Thank you. That was very insightful right there. I'm gonna just, this is always, I have to ask the two party representatives, so I'm gonna give the similar question to be fair here to Nemir, to maybe, obviously you can agree, disagree, or maybe give us your view. It doesn't have to be only on foreign policy, obviously, but I think what, from your point of view, the young people would like to see or will see in this coalition. And, if you can give us a hint of what it means for the rest of the world, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think many young people in Germany are, for many young people in Germany, it's quite important that the new coalition will be tough on human rights and is not doing what the Grand Coalition has done, that it has repeatedly put economic interests over human rights. When it comes to Russia, for example, if we look at Nord Stream 2, both Greens and Liberals are against Nord Stream 2 and want to end the project. Or if we look at China, both Greens and Liberals are for a tough stance against China. And that is also a possibility actually where Germany and the US hopefully can work much more closer together in the future. For example, when I look at Joe Biden, who said the US would step in the defense of Taiwan, the Liberals actually have not decided that, but they have decided that they want to assist Taiwan diplomatically, that China won't attack it, and that they, in principle, support the self-determination of the Taiwanese people. And also, both parties are quite strong on human rights when it comes to the internation camps in Xinjiang. So there could be a lot of movement. It will be tricky how the Social Democrats will go along with that or try to hinder this a bit, because in the past we have seen that, especially regarding Russia, but also regarding China, they were quite soft and were leaning more to an appeasement approach. So Greens and Liberals could work there quite closely together. When it comes to NATO, on the other hand, then I think there will also be differences between the Free Democrats on the one hand and the Greens and Social Democrats on the other. The Free Democrats do support the 2% goal that NATO has decided, so that 2% of the GDP have to go into the defense budget. They also in favor of the nuclear participation, while the Greens are, I think, quite skeptical, and the Social Democrats as well. So that will be points where we will have some clinches during the coalition talks. And then obviously when it comes to trade, the Free Democrats are very much in favor of free trade, want to ratify the CETA agreement with Canada, would like to have a renewed effort for a transatlantic free trade agreement. And the Greens and also the Social Democrats see free trade a bit more skeptical. So there will also be some clashes there.
Great, that was very helpful. Now I'm going to turn over to the audience. We have a bunch of questions here, so I'm not going to ask all of you to And so you can, if you have something to say about one of the questions, please, just jump in. But let's start with the first one here from Parvin, who's asking about the election age. I know that was a debate in the campaign. So I do not know if maybe, I don't know, if one of the political representatives, so to speak, wants to take this. The question is, how would this reshape political parties? What did you make of that discussion? Who wants to go first? Charlotte. Okay, Charlotte.
Also, I mean, if we both answer the question, Nemir can go first because I was always the one to go first.
Yeah, I can just briefly answer the question. I think it will give young people a stronger voice in the German parliament and in the German elections, but we should not overestimate it. We already talked about it. The vast majority of voters are over the age of 60s. There are more voters older than 60 than are younger than 30, and that won't change if we lower the election age. And regarding the second question, what the Social Democrats think of that, they're actually in favor of lowering the voting age. Of course, internally, they should think how they reach more young people, because for them it won't turn out profitable. But actually deciding on the right to vote shouldn't be something you do for political purposes, but because you believe that it is the right or not the right thing to do.
Charlotte, if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Nemir said, because I think with the issue of young voting participation, you can really see that for the Free Democrats and for the Greens and also for the SPD, it's an issue that they're not only it's not comparable to gerrymandering in the US, for example, necessarily, which I think is a discussion that could be commonly linked if you don't know a lot about the argument, because as Nemir said, I mean, if you compare how much of the vote the Greens and the FDP got from people under the age of 30, you see that it was a 400,000 votes around about for the FDP and about 450 or 30,000 for the Greens. So it's not like lowering the voting age will make a difference anytime soon. It will have long-term effects, definitely, on all parties, but it wouldn't result in 45% for the Greens and 30% for the FDP anytime soon. But we still wanted to do it because it's the right thing to do, because I think every person who was campaigning on the streets this summer for the election talked to people who were 15, 16, 17, who had been politically active or at least politically interested for years in some cases, and who saw the also quite big share of non-voters amongst 60 plus people, which was also not negligible, and who saw their future being thrown away. This links back to the argument I said earlier about do people think we need fundamental change, or do they think we're on the right track? But I think with this issue, you can see that it's a issue that really needs to be brought forward by the coalition, because it's the right thing to do, as Nemir said.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can get the next one in the direction of Sara, and the others can chime in, obviously. So the question is, what percentage of first-time voters voted? And I don't have that number, so if you don't have it, that's of course okay. But I'm interested in your take on the second part of the question. So does the young generation trust they can achieve their goals through parliament, or rather through activism? I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, or you could expand it, instead of parliament, through parties. I mean, we have, obviously, that's what we're discussing here, the result in the election. But clearly, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of activism, especially around climate change, but also social justice in the last few years. So Sara, what's your take? Is this generation still believing in this path, in the parliamentary system? Was this a positive signal, this election, in that regard?
Well, of course, this is a wild guess now, but yes, I think that young people will be active on the streets, but they will be, of course, Democrats. And I mean, we have seen in the Corona crisis how important it is to give also young people a voice. I mean, I remember this one time, I think it was around Christmas last time, Germany was about to go into lockdown again. And Chancellor Merkel addressed the young people as the party people and kind of held them responsible for the spread of the virus. And there she made them seem selfish and told them that spending Christmas with their grandparents should be more important than partying right now. And of course that stuck. because at that time young people had way more bigger problems than not being able to party, and they felt unseen and unheard. And in fact, they might have been, because billions of aid flowed into the economy while young people were forgotten in the crisis. I mean, hairdressers were allowed to open long before schools and universities did. And you could get the feeling that our politicians didn't see young people, kind of had forgotten how it is to be young, and also maybe didn't care about them because, well, they knew that in Germany, young people are really a minority. And I think this time only about 15% of the voters are under 30. So I think it would be important to give them a voice. And yeah, I think it will be important that the FDP and the Greens will see young people in our state and will give them a voice, because in Germany we also can see a generational split. I mean, the youth voted for change, and older people tend to want everything to stay as it is, because Germany is a wealthy state with a strong economy, so why change? And maybe older people voted in fear of change and younger people voted in the fear of standing still. But something did change. We'll have the youngest parliament ever now, and the two parties at the center of this generational shift will shape this government and the future of this country. And I think we will see change, and they are already changing ways of how things are normally done. I mean, at the night of the election, Christian Lindner reached out to the Greens, asking them to talk first to each other before a meeting with the two bigger parties. And from the night where they talked, they posted a selfie on social media talking about the bridges they were building. And they made it clear that they will implement another culture of discussion with more respect and understanding. And I think for young people, this might be, I don't know, a feeling that makes them hopeful for the future.
The next question is from an anonymous attendee, and it's asking about what might a compromise be between the SPD, FDP, and Greens in the context of specific policies. So you can pick one here, but I think this is a question maybe that our political representatives, I mean, you mentioned this earlier when we discussed what issues were important for the youth vote. So, for example, on the Greens, climate change, and then Nemir mentioned, digitalization, the future of pensions. There are clearly some, I mean, I think it was Nemir who laid out the differences between them, or his view of what the FDP sees differently than the Greens. So are you hopeful that there's a concrete compromise on, for example, climate change or migration? I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe Charlotte this time then.
I think it really depends on the actual policy issue. So I think it also depends, because in some policy issues, in the view of the Greens, you can reach a compromise, whereas in other policy issues you can't. And one of those where many Greens and Green voters are convinced that you cannot reach a compromise is actual climate change, because even if people who are arguing that climate change is that there is climate change and a climate crisis and it needs to be stopped, aren't saying, okay, we should reach the 1.5% goal, but if we only hit like 1%, that's a good compromise, because some people don't want any reducing our emissions, and some people do want some reduction, and so we'll meet at 1%, and that's great. No, that's like the Greens and Green voters are convinced that there's like 1.5% is the minimum. And so of course you've heard in the discussion we've seen very disappointed voices from both voters, from scientists, from activists, saying that, for example, in the if you look at climate change in the preliminary results of the coalition talks, it's not enough, because still we have this phrasing that I think has been is by now kind of popular, with people saying that ideally we'll stop producing and burning coal until 2030, which is exactly the kind of open-ended, vague statement you do not need in climate policy in Germany right now. And I think which is what many people did not want and did not expect from climate talks, because we have three parties together that agree that facing the climate crisis and climate change is one of the key issues in the next few years. But then people are they're still open to build modern gas, like burning stations, for example, and like to maybe ideally move out of burning coal until 2030. So of course, like it's important to compromise in a coalition, but that's one of the issues where we see compromise sometimes that does not really work. And I think linking it back to the question Sarah was asked earlier about like if young people think parliamentarism is the way to go or if activism on the streets is the way to go, I think the results of these preliminary coalition talks have convinced some people that like the parliamentary system is actually not what it takes to face the crises we're seeing today, or at least a global crisis like the climate crisis, because they see, like for example, a young voter asked me while campaigning, so I know that the Greens will have to, like, if they form a government, they will have to compromise. So I will vote for the left party because at least they're asking to be climate neutral by 2035. And so if they have to compromise, we reach the point 2040, which was actually like a demand of the Greens. And so I think this is the way some young people are thinking about their future, because they see that in some issues, compromise is not enough to address some issues. And so I think it will leave some room for frustration with activists, with scientists, and with young voters on these issues.
Okay, Nemir, same question. How do you see the situation?
I see the situation a bit different. I think we already have reached in the first paper that was published by the partners a good foundation for a future compromise regarding climate policy. So, for example, we have said that we want to expand the European emission trading system and also the national emission trading system. There's the compromise regarding cars. Originally, the Free Democrats were against prohibiting fossil cars that run on fossil fuels completely, and the Greens wanted to prohibit them by 2030. Now we have put the date to 2035, and but have made the exception that cars who run on e-fuels, so e-fuels are fuels that produce no CO2 emissions, that they will still be allowed after 2035. There are regarding gas, we have agreed that we want, not gas, sorry, regarding coal, we have agreed on the date 2030, ideally, of course. Regarding all these goals, it will be important how we play them out in detail. That must be the mission for the current talks, that we find a detailed path on how we reach that goals, how we exactly expand the emission trading system, how exactly exactly the coal phase out will work. But I think that what we have already made is quite a good foundation for a compromise and a good route for actually reaching the 1.5, to limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees, which is something that both the Greens and the Liberals agree on. And regarding migration, I actually don't see a lot of differences. So I think we're quite similar in that we want to protect the right to asylum, want to have a modern immigration system comparable to Canada, and that we also want to establish safe routes for refugees. So I don't see a lot of conflict potential there. And regarding the European Union, the real conflict potential is actually just about the question, should the EU be able to make more debt or not? They are probably, the solution will be it stays as it is, I think. But the other topics like reforming the European Parliament, there we are on the same page regarding that.
Okay. All right, we're almost out of time. I'm going to bundle the last two questions and then ask you for very quick answers, and you can pick and choose. So the question that Jack is asking, basically, you already talked a bit about foreign policy, but is there greater or lesser importance to foreign policy issues in the youth vote, and which issues are the most important? So that's one you can pick if you want, or you can tie it into the second question here, which is asking specifically about the view of the situation in the EU with regard to Poland and Hungary, and more generally about deepening and widening the EU. So you can use this, pick and choose, and then make it a closing statement and wrapping it all up nicely. So I don't know who has a first take. If you want, Nemir, if you look like you're ready to answer this.
Yes, just a moment regarding the yes. So I would pick the question regarding Poland, Hungary, and the European Union. We have now actually a rule of law mechanism within the European Union that is structured that if a country like Poland or Hungary is violating certain standards, then they get their subsidies that they're receiving from the European Union get cut. And the real issue is that this measure just needs to be implemented. Parliament has already sued the European Commission, who would be responsible for implementing measures, to finally implement sanctions against Poland and Hungary. So I think there won't happen much more regarding this. It's now for the Court of Justice of the European Union to decide. Obviously, Greens and Liberals both want a much harsher rule of law mechanism, but that will be quite difficult to achieve, because for such major reforms, you in most cases need the consent of all member states, including Poland and Hungary. So that makes it quite difficult to get a real proper reform there. But regarding EU reforms on another level, we have currently the Conference on the Future of Europe, which should talk to the citizens of Europe and collect ideas how we can reform the EU. And I think it's quite important that the Future Coalition uses this momentum, also uses, by the way, the fact that we have a very pro-European president in France right now with Emmanuel Macron, who's quite open for EU reforms, and take on maybe even some changes of the EU treaties. So I mentioned a few points, improving the European Parliament through transnational list, giving the EU Parliament the right to initiate legislation, having majority decisions in the Council of Ministers, that the EU can have a strong foreign policy and is not dependent on each member state accepting, because in that way we won't have a strong European policy. So that, I think, is a way to go, and that would be quite important if the next coalition tackles these issues.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to add anything to this? Feel free to pick.
No, I think Emir said everything that is to say about this question.
This helps me maintain time. Thank you. So, Charlotte, you have, if you want, the last word, and you can obviously pick parts of the questions.
I think Nemir, as Nemir said earlier, I think FDP and Greens broadly agree on the general direction of EU policy and share like similar concerns, except for debt. And so I won't answer that question, but instead, because somebody else asked about it, what foreign policy issues were important to young voters in Germany, and what role does foreign policy play in the lives of in the voting decisions of young voters. And I think there's like kind of, if you look at the generation that's like the age of Sara and Nemir and me, we're all around about like 20, 25, late 20s. You see that all of us have like kind of grown up in a Germany that's had like a stable place in the world. I think none of us were like, I mean, we were all like very young when Germany was still the sick man of Europe and was being regarded as such. And we've grown up like in Merkel times, where Germany has tendentially like become more prosperous, has always been like the key important player in the European Union, has commanded the respect of the US, of Russia, and of other like important players, with a chancellor that has been very like secure on the international stage. And I think that has very much shaped the kind of like foreign policy awareness and the awareness of Germany in the world of young people today, as for example, as opposed to voters who were born in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, where Germany was, of course, after the war and after Nazism in Germany, very much struggling to find its role, or also voters born in the late 70s or 80s or 90s, which have witnessed the reunification of Germany, and also this kind of moment in time where other European states especially were very kind of afraid what was going to happen now that Germany was suddenly like a quarter larger and thus much larger than, for example, Spain or Italy or France or the UK, like the then key players of the European Union. And I think like people born in the mid 90s or early 2000s had like do not know these experiences, but have instead known a Germany that kind of has a place in the world and commands kind of respect and is also like a key economic player. And I think that kind of shapes how people see foreign policy issues as important or not important, because I think when I talk to the young voters, one of the most important thing they kind of asked or were interested in about who would become the new chancellor was, how does this person represent Germany in the world? Like, for example, I think that was a reason why younger and older voters decided to vote for Olaf Scholz, because they knew he had international experience and they knew like his name was a known one in the international arena. And for example, one of the questions I was asked about both Christian Lindner, the most like famous politician of the FDP in Germany, and also Annalena Baerbock, who was the chancellor candidate in Germany for the Greens, was, how would this person face up to Putin? I think that like that was a very important question actually for young voters, because they had only known Merkel, who has like a very secure stance. She's also quite, quite dry and not progressive or forward looking very much. But they knew she commanded the respect of threatening and friendly international players. And I think in that way, kind of like, how does Germany feel? How does Germany behave? How's Germany represented? That was important to some sections of the young voters in Germany.
Thank you. That was, I learned a lot in not only this round of answers, but overall, I thought, and I have to say, I'm also, this was in fluent English for everybody, as if that's normal 30, 40 years ago. Younger representatives, that might have not been as easy. So progress in many ways. But thank you so much all for joining us. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks everybody from the attendees for joining. And I hope to see everybody soon again at the next Transatlantic Tuesday. Thank you.